There's a popular turn of phrase that everyone is the hero of their own story, which is one of the most commonly misinterpreted aphorisms of writing and reality both, up there with blood is thicker than water and one rotten apple means all the other apples are fine, I think. It sounds like it should mean that everyone thinks of their actions as good and heroic, and that's fully not true. Plenty of people will do bad things wholly aware that what they're doing is wrong. I think it's a lot more accurate to say that everyone is the hero of their own story in that they think whatever they're doing is justified, narratively coherent, emotionally compelling, perfectly understandable considering everything going on in their life. Not everyone acts heroically, but everyone is standing under the spotlight on their own personal stage. And under this spotlight, someone can do the most heinous things without ever losing the idea that they're still the hero of their story, even if their internal justification is as simple as just that they're the most important character and the only person whose feelings matter. Logically, burning the world down is wrong and we all know it. Emotionally, burning the world down can feel completely warranted for all sorts of reasons. This is a useful thing to keep in mind when writing bad guys. It's usually pretty easy to motivate a hero because heroes are generally reactive. Throw a problem at them and they'll be compelled to respond. But when it comes to motivating the problems themselves, things can get a little more hand-wavy. It's easy to make a bad guy who's just evil because someone has to be, but it's more complicated to write a bad guy who is simultaneously really evil and relatably complex and human. They have to be both extremely villainous and believably cast as the hero of their own story. This difficulty exists in writing because it also exists in the real world. We often have a lot of trouble emotionally reconciling the fact that someone can do really evil stuff while also being relatably human. It feels wrong or unfair that someone who does terrible things could also be a genuinely good friend or loving parent or whatever. It's easier to split people into the disparate categories of real human being and inhuman monster capable of such cruelty, because that way we never need to tackle that perceived contradiction. Easier to think that the person who does the monstrous evil was only ever faking being a real human person, because real human people would never do something like that. But the fact is, there is no contradiction here. People can do all kinds of horrible things without thinking twice about it, as long as they feel like it's the reasonable and understandable thing for them to do. Even the simplest motivation there is, because I wanted to, can be all it takes. But the because I wanted to crowd don't tend to be particularly deep thinkers, and it can add a nice layer of complexity if the bad guy has some actual reason why they think the problems they're causing are completely justified, as the complex and nuanced protagonist of whatever drama they're playing out on their own personal stage. That reason can be logical, emotional, moral, ideological, whatever, as long as what the bad guy is doing makes sense to them. And it's even more compelling if they're doing it for a reason that also makes sense to us, maybe even a reason that makes us sympathize or pity them. In these cases, the cruelty of the character doesn't make them seem less human. Instead, it highlights the painfully human reasons behind that cruelty, obliterating the false dichotomy between real people who would never do such a thing and inhuman monsters who would. It forces us to look this character in the eye and see both the monster and the person are one and the same. And perhaps if we then turn the eye inward, we may see what parts of our own humanity could be driven to equal acts of monstrosity. When a bad guy is allowed to be the hero of their own story, they take on a very compelling air, especially if that story is a tragedy. One could almost call these poor unfortunate beings tragic monsters. Now, despite all this preamble, at first glance, the tragic monster sounds a bit vaguely defined. It's a monster that's tragic. Lots of things are tragic. Cool motive, still murder. And it's not like monster is going to be any easier to lock down a definition for. Is a tragic monster just a monster that's sad? Or a monster that makes us sad? But despite its component vocabulary being loose at best, fortunately for us, the tragic monster sits comfortably at the center of a pretty simple Venn diagram. The three ingredients of the tragic monster are these: threat, distress, and lack of agency. Threat is the easiest and most self-explanatory factor. A tragic monster is dangerous because otherwise it wouldn't be much of a monster. The tragic monster is an antagonistic figure, at least at first. Distress is also pretty intuitive. A tragic monster is not happy to be what it is or do what it does, because an enthusiastic monster is really only tragic for the people it mauls. The tragic monster must be unhappy with its lot, whether it's miserable because of what it is or just because of how it's treated for what it is. And on that note, it's the lack of agency that really defines the tragic monster. There's something about it that it has no control over. This can be something that's been done to it, or just the way it was born. It's almost always a physical characteristic, too. Mental traumas can work for this, but tragic backstories are a dime a dozen in fiction, and the tragic monster usually needs something a little more meaty to really make it properly miserable. This factor is usually the cause of its distress, and can also be a component of the threat it poses. Put all these ingredients together, and the tragic monster takes a more comprehensible shape. A tragic monster is what it is through no fault of its own, is not happy about being what it is, and is dangerous to the people around it. Lots of classic classic threats fit this model. All zombies, almost all werewolves, the archetypical Frankenstein's monster, and more broadly, any victim of fucked up mad science. Monsters who were once normal people but became warped or infected or cursed in some irreversible way and are now deadly threats. Characters that are unquestionably dangerous and potentially even actively malevolent, but inspire pity regardless because they are both perpetrator and victim of some terrible tragedy. In some cases, the tragic monster may even seek out or welcome its own destruction to really drive home how heartbreakingly unfair everything is. We can also see pretty quickly why all three of these factors are necessary to create the tragic monster. If you try to make one without the threat component, you get a Quasimodo, a character who is unhappy about something they can't control about themselves and the way they're treated for it, but not really inclined to do any damage. These guys are only tragic until they find friends and loved ones who accept the parts of them they've previously been feared for, at which point everything works out. Without the distress, you get a classic monster sans tragic, one that didn't ask to be born or made very dangerous, but is nonetheless very happy to be a terrible threat. And if you remove the lack of agency, you get a character who's dangerous and unhappy, but in complete control of themselves and their trajectory in life. In short, a regular villain with poor job satisfaction. No, the tragic monster needs all three. They didn't choose to be this way, they don't like being this way, and they're making it everyone's problem. One of the biggest examples, literally, is the original conceit behind Godzilla. I've already talked about this in more depth in my old kaiju video, but before he got his rough edges sanded off for market-friendly WWE matches with rubber suits and giant puppets, Godzilla was a victim of the H-bomb testing in the Pacific, mutated painfully and horribly, driven to rampage by the flippant and careless hubris of humanity. He's terribly dangerous, in extreme distress, and is not responsible for his own monstrosity. We are. He's the perfect archetypical tragic monster, and one of the only ones who isn't also, on some level, a full person. Godzilla is characterized as an animal, confused, in pain, out of his depth, unfamiliar with his own mutated body, and driven by a blend of instincts and pure, horrific agony. Godzilla's director Ishiro Honda said, "Monsters are tragic beings. They are born too tall, too strong, too heavy. They are not evil by choice. That is their tragedy. They do not attack people because they want to, but because of their size and strength, mankind has no other choice but to defend himself. After several stories such as this, people end up having a kind of affection for the monsters. They end up caring about them." And he's super right. It's not their fault that they are what they are, but the danger is still inarguable, and that means conflict is inevitable. It's unfortunate. A situation with no clean win condition where everyone winds up happy. Tragic monsters inspire pity first and foremost, and that means that even their defeat is no cause for unconditional celebration. But pity is not all that they inspire. Tragic monsters usually start where Godzilla does, stripped of agency, distressed, and dangerous. But a lot of tragic monsters are a little more thinky than Godzilla, and start making informed decisions very quickly. This can send them down complex character arcs that may keep them pitiable, but may also start layering on more things that can supplement that pity, with things like, for instance, a good dose of cool motive still murder. As an example, almost every Batman villain is a tragic monster, because they're all narrative foils of Batman in one way or another, and Batman himself is a tragic monster. Very dangerous, never happy, and shaped every moment of his life by the awful, senseless tragedy that destroyed him at age 8. So to properly play off of that, most of his rogues gallery are the same way. People whose chances at a normal, happy life were obliterated by some outside force, usually an encounter with an unsecured chemical vat or a big fire. Although some of them, like the Penguin, Killer Croc, and Baby Doll, are afflicted by genetic conditions that have made them look unusual their whole lives, inspiring cruelty and dehumanization from the people around them. But whether their villain origin hits prenatal or post-graduation, they all start the same way. Something terrible and unfair happens to them, and either gives them dangerous superpowers or the motivation to go out and buy the dangerous superpowers available to all Gothamites under the Second Amendment. And then they start doing crime. And this is where the tragedy of the tragic monster starts to become more of a foundation for their character, to be built on by their subsequent choices. Does it suck what happened to Two-Face? Absolutely. Does it still get kinda hard to feel sorry for him after a while? Yes. It wasn't their fault that the world was cruel and unfair to them, but everything they did from that point forward was their fault and their choice. And while they remain a tragic monster throughout, they also become proper villains through the decisions they make and the doubling down they do after their tragic origins resolve. And after a while, the villainy can start to eclipse the original tragedy that motivated it. Which is why it's such a good character beat that Batman always retains that awareness of tragedy, never stops pitying his rogues and trying to help them after he's done beating them up and dismantling their latest schemes. He's compassionate enough to keep the tragedy in mind even after the rogues have stacked a bunch of atrocities on top of them and made themselves pretty hard to sympathize with. Spider-Man has a similar situation, actually. actually. A lot of his rogues are tragic monsters in one form or another, and even the ones who are more commonly portrayed as just plain bad have been reimagined as tragic monsters in more recent stories. Marvel's Sony Spider-Man 2 for the PS5, and also Knuckles is there, gave this treatment to Venom, who in most versions is a vindictive asshole who's gleefully and willfully malicious, but in this game he's a victim of a debilitating incurable illness comboed with his dad hitting him with an experimental medical treatment that turns out to be an alien goo with a crush on Spider-Man. He even hits the classic tragic monster beat where he begs Spider-Man to destroy him to save everyone else. What's interesting is that the previous game in the series did a similar reimagining with a twist. See, in that game, Peter's status quo from the very beginning has him interning with lovable Dr. Otto Octavius, who everyone in the audience knows damn well is destined to become Spider-Man's second most iconic foe, Dr. Octopus. But Otto is a well-meaning, bumbling, sympathetic underdog fighting for funding while seething at the dispassionate cruelty of local rich asshole Norman Osborn, and also secretly afflicted with a debilitating, incurable illness that he's seeking to bypass by giving himself some cool robot tentacles to keep doing his science when his body stops working. Seems totally fine and chill, but oh no, those robot tentacles might be warping his mind and driving him mad. This is a classic recipe for a tragic monster, and in fact this recipe has been used for Dr. Octopus before. It's basically what the Sam Raimi Spider-Man 2 did with him, where he was a completely chill guy until an accident involving the tentacles kind of made him go crazy. And the way the game plays it, we see pretty quick after this reveal how very dangerous Otto is becoming when he breaks out the Sinister Six and has them beat the ever-loving shit out of Spider-Man, while he goes full mask-off supervillain and unleashes a bioweapon on New York City. And the worst part is Peter believes the old Otto must still be in there. He's become this terrifying monster through no fault of his own, just bad luck and an incurable illness and the desperation caused by Norman's own immoral cruelty and, of course, lest we forget, the robot tentacles that are driving him cuckoo bananas. Otto's just a victim in all this, right? And then in the final boss fight, Otto drops that he's actually known Peter's secret identity the whole game, which completely reframes everything up to this point, especially that vicious ass-beating he dished out with the Sinister Six, and all of his other supervillainy since then, because this reveals that he knew that was his beloved student Peter he was brutalizing the whole time. And while Otto is still unquestionably a victim of a lot of different unfair circumstances, this one reveal demonstrates that he is also a cruel and brutal manipulator who's been using Peter's sympathy for him to lure him into traps and further his own murderous schemes this whole time. This is what makes Peter snap and start actually seriously fighting him, and Otto really drives the point home when, after he loses, he tries to play it like Peter has snapped him out of it, and he's really very sorry, and also remember he knows his secret identity, so does he really think it's a good idea to send him to jail? That last little threat is the perfect punctuation on the slide into irredeemability, and Peter slam dunks him into prison and goes off to grieve the mentor he thought he knew, and also Aunt May, who incidentally does not make it out of the video game alive. As a character, Doc Ock gets slingshotted through being a tragic monster and then out the other side into being an absolutely loathsome villain just by how he played on Peter's and the audience's sympathies to throw us all off balance and gain a tactical edge. And that is one of the more interesting arcs that a tragic monster can play out, by separating out that crucial element of the Venn diagram, the threat. In this format, the character starts off wholly sympathetic, a victim of unfair circumstances, miserable and unhappy and forever changed by something beyond their control. And then, instead of having dangerousness thrust upon them, they choose it, perhaps as a method of regaining some semblance of control or agency, or of avenging themselves on the cruel world that did this to them in the first place. The tragedy happens outside of their control, but they choose to become a monster, and as they double down and slide past the moral event horizon, the tragedy of their circumstance starts to shrink in the rearview mirror, until all that's left in view is the danger they pose and how much they need to be stopped. Of course, there's an inversion of this too, because not every tragic monster has to end in tragedy. As discussed, if you remove the danger from the tragic monster, you get a classic Quasimodo, a character who really just needs friends and support to help counter their unhappiness and the unfairness of whatever life situation they're otherwise powerless to stop. And while that might not be super workable in, say, the zombie situations where the tragic monster is incurably deadly to those around it, in some cases, that's not an unattainable goal. Consider the Hulk, a textbook tragic monster at origin who becomes a massive danger every time he feels angry or threatened, which happens a lot while being hunted down by scary men with guns. In some runs, Bruce Banner devotes a lot of time and energy to trying to cure the Hulk so he stops transforming into him. Hypothetically, this would undo the tragedy he had zero agency in and remove the danger and the distress at the root. But this would be a bit narratively unsatisfying, so most versions of the character will instead try a different approach, to question whether the Hulk is really so inherently bad, or if he could be a force for good good in the world if Thunderbolt Ross would just stop sending scary men with guns after him for like 5 minutes. The Hulk can be, and frequently is, heroic, and it's only the fear and prejudice of humanity that forces his life to be a tragic one. There's no way for him to stop being powerful, but the danger he poses is almost entirely reactive, which means if people stop being jerks to him, he could potentially stop being a tragic monster. And if you want to know where they got that idea from, credit, as it so often does, goes straight back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Victor's creature is not born dangerous or distressed, but he quickly learns that distress is inevitable because he scares the ever-loving shit out of everyone around him. And because Victor refuses to take responsibility for him or provide him a companion so he's not forced to go through life alone, the creature decides it has no recourse but revenge and starts turning Victor's life into the kind of nightmare that Victor so carelessly and cavalierly inflicted on him. In the recent Guillermo del Toro movie adaptation of the same story, del Toro takes this plotline through some waypoints and to an ending that it never got in the book. The movie is overall not super interested in faithfully adapting the original story. Elements of it are fully fanfiction or derived from the old Universal monster movie aesthetics, and the del Toro bingo card is on full display. But one thing is preserved, and that is the creature is unquestionably a tragic monster. He starts off as an innocent tabula rasa, and then Victor is such a shitty, awful parent that he teaches the creature pain, fear, and hatred before he ever even gets a look at the sun. Then once he gets free, he learns how much he terrifies everyone who sees him, and so the lack of agency begins to kick in. The creature never asked to be made, never asked to look like this, and since he quickly learns that in this version he can't even die, it becomes very clear that there's nothing he can do about anything. And of course, the threat. The creature is, true to form, very strong, and everyone around him is very fragile, and he does brutalize some wolves and some hunters that were already trying to kill him, but he doesn't really start doing anything intentionally scary until Elizabeth dies, which, contrary to the book version where he kills her to punish Victor, in this version is because she takes a bullet for him when Victor tries to shoot him. This is what I mean with the fanfiction and such. But in this version of the story, this is kind of the capstone on the unfair cruelty of Victor's actions. Elizabeth has spent the movie tragically out of focus, mostly because, despite her banter with Victor, he clearly doesn't actually care about her as a person, and is more just frustrated that she doesn't want to be his girlfriend. So the only real glimpses of her depth of character come through in the conversations Victor's not really listening to, and when she's bleeding out in the creature's arms. And she's not even hit the ground before Victor is yelling at everyone that the creature killed her. Everyone break out the torches and pitchforks because that monster just killed our ingenue. Victor just stone-cold manslaughtered the woman he allegedly loves, and he's immediately using it as more ammunition to make everyone hurt the creature. I've gone back and forth on this a little bit, but I've come to the conclusion that it feels like the movie didn't fridge Elizabeth, Victor fridged Elizabeth. It's a tough balance for a writer to strike, but I think they pull it off. It doesn't feel like the movie is dismissing her value as a character, it feels like Victor is the one doing that. Anyway, this is what leads to the creature becoming actively malevolent in his pursuit of Victor, and they sort of speed run through the hunt into the Arctic and the subsequent final confrontation. But the fanfiction kicks back in, as on his deathbed, Victor does something his book version never manages to pull off. He apologizes. He realizes he was perpetuating the cycle of parental abuse on an innocent child who was relying on him to teach and protect him, and he advises the creature not to try and die, but to find a way to live. And in the end of the movie, the creature uses his terrifying strength to break the stranded ship out of its ice and float it back homewards. Del Toro's angle seems to be that the tragedy of the creature's life is not inevitable due to his innate existence, but caused by his shitty F-tier father figure who sucks. And honestly, fair. That's textually supported, and is at least a solvable problem. And this approach, the question of how much a tragic monster needs to be tragic, is an interesting area for writers to explore. Some tragic monsters are pretty much screwed. There's almost no way to de-tragedy a zombie, but even a lot of classical tragic monsters have been sort of narratively rehabilitated over time. Back in the Universal horror movie days, being a werewolf was basically just as bad as being a zombie, except you spend 95% of the time fully aware of the horrors you unleash when you lose control. But nowadays, werewolves are, for the most part, the hot, non-threatening monster romance option. Characters who experience unfixable tragedies and fall into villainy to cope are often extended a helping hand, a support network, hell, maybe even an actual therapist nowadays. While you still get your classic Godzillas and your universal werewolves and your victims of corrupting, irreversible changes that strip away their minds and turn them into slavering nightmare beasts, if a tragic monster is even slightly still a person in there, a lot of stories will highlight that while you may have no choice about starring in a tragedy, it is always a choice to become a monster, and it's never too late to choose otherwise. And while most of us will never get bitten by werewolves, more's the pity, all of us could still probably stand to be reminded of that once in a while, whenever burning the world to the ground starts sounding nice and tempting. So, yeah.
Slipping through the cracks of a dark eternity.
eternity with nothing but my pain and the paralyzing agony to tell me who I am, who I was. Uncertainty enveloping my mind till I can't break free. And maybe it's a dream, maybe nothing else is real, but it wouldn't mean a thing if I told you how I feel. So I'm tired of all the pain, of the misery inside, and I wish that I could live feeling nothing but the night. You can tell me what to say, you can tell me where to go, but I doubt that I would care, and my heart would never know. If I make another move, there'll be no more turning back, because everything would change and it all will fade to black.